Good evening. Great to be learning with you on a Sunday. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house? Yehud in South Carolina, Renee in Indiana, Stephen in New Hampshire, Melissa in Great Neck, Paula in Chicago, Bill in Missouri, Bella in Florida, Sharon in New Jersey, Joseph in Massachusetts, Lucy in Minnesota, John in Surfside Beach, South Carolina, Tom in PA. What happened there? Joseph, I don't know who is an ignoramus, but we will find out. I'm a little ignorant. I'll tell you a story about that in a moment. Paul in the Great Northwest, Paul in Minneapolis, John in Maine, Brian in Boston, Marjorie in Georgia. So this term, Am-Haaretz, comes up with a little bit of frequency in the Talmud. What are we reading here, right? This is the Koren Talmud, the Koren edition, the Koren translation, publication, which contains the elucidation and commentary of the great Rabbi Rav Adin Steinsaltz, who I refer to very often in our journey together. So I had the great fortune to meet and interview Rav Steinsaltz some years ago, thanks to the Accidental Talmudist platform. So I met with him at his office in Jerusalem, and we had a film crew, and it was a great little interview. And so he asked me, so tell me more about Accidental Talmudist. What is that? So I told him the story. Which many of you have heard, but just to sum it up, some years before, when my grandmother died, I reconnected with Judaism and started learning and taking classes with various rabbis around LA. And of course, every rabbi will sooner or later mention the Talmud, usually sooner. And so I was curious about the Talmud, but it was so vast, right? If you look at the Art Scroll edition of the Talmud, 73 volumes, and that's the one that I would often see when I would go to the mitzvah store, a Judaic and bookshop store here in LA. Now it's in our neighborhood. It used to be in the Pico Robertson neighborhood. And I'd always look at those volumes, and there were so many of them, it was so intimidating. And I said, well, I'm curious about it, but I guess it's not for me. And then one time I was in that store, went through that same thought process and said, what am I so scared of? They're just books. There must be a book one. I'll get that, see what it's like. Figured out book one, took it to the counter, and the kid at the register says, you're doing Daf Yomi. And I said, what's Daf Yomi? And he looked at me like this. Right? And I felt like such an idiot, right? Because I just didn't know what was going on. Now, that's what I said to Rav Steinsaltz as I was telling the story. I'll come back to that in a moment. But I just didn't know what Daf Yomi was. I said, what's Daf Yomi? And he looked at me like that. And he says, well, Daf Yomi is a program where people around the world are reading the entire Talmud, 1 page a day, on the same schedule. It takes 7.5 years. And today, that day, was day one, right? So I happened to buy book one of the Talmud on day one of a 7.5 year cycle, which I took as a sign from Hashem that I need to take this seriously. And so I stayed with it and completed Daf Yomi. So that day was in 2005, and I completed my first cycle through in 2012. And toward the end of that, started this blog. First it was a blog at the Jewish Journal, and then a Facebook page, and it's grown and grown, and here we are learning together all these years later. So at any rate, in 2000, I believe it was 14, when I was in Jerusalem and telling this story to Rav Steinsaltz, and he said, well, the guy looked at me funny like that. And I said, and I felt like such an idiot. So he interrupted me and he says, oh, Am-Haaretz, ignoramus, much worse than an idiot. Right? By which he meant that, an idiot, okay, is somebody who has limited capacity, That's something that they're born with. But an Am-Haaretz is somebody who chooses to remain ignorant. He has the ability, he has the opportunity to learn, to study Torah in some form, and he turns his back on it. That's an Am-Haaretz. That's an ignoramus, right? It's somebody who's willfully ignorant, as we shall see today. All right, let's get into it. We are on Daf Chaf Beis, page 22, here in Tractate Sotah, the 18th volume of the Talmud, generally the laws of the suspected adulteress. Here in chapter 3, we're continuing our discussion of the ritual itself, when the temple was standing and the suspected adulteress would come and drink the bitter water. And we're continuing our discussion, I think, of Mishna number 2. Right? Mishna number 2. And the discussion centers on this idea that if she had committed adultery, then when she drinks the bitter water, it should kill her right away because she was guilty of adultery. That's the point of the bitter water. If she didn't commit adultery when she secluded herself with that man she was warned not to seclude herself with, but she didn't actually commit adultery, so the bitter water will, not harm her at all. It will prove her innocence, and then she and her husband can become permitted to each other again. But if she's guilty, it will just sort of cause her body to fall apart and she'll die. And it'll happen immediately. That's what we learned in our Mishnah. However, if she has some merit, then she won't die right away. The sort of heavenly decree of death will be delayed by a year, maybe 2 years, maybe even 3 years, right? And so yesterday we were discussing, well, what is that merit? Is it that she performed many mitzvahs? Is it that she studied a lot of Torah? That's a discussion that's been going on. And as part of this discussion, once we're talking about Torah study, the sages come to this question near the top of page 22a. And the sages taught, who is an Am-Haaretz? Who is an ignoramus? It is anyone who does not recite shema in the morning and evening with its blessings. Now, obviously, what they're talking about here is a Jew, right? So a non-Jew does not become an ignoramus because he's ignorant of Jewish law. He has no obligation to learn Jewish law. So this wouldn't apply to non-Jews. But if you're a Jew and you know you're a Jew and you remain willfully ignorant of Jewish law, and particularly this obligation to recite the Shema, the sort of basic prayer of Judaism, morning and evening, right? Because we learn it. It's in Deuteronomy and in Numbers, a combination of paragraphs. And you shall love the Lord first, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. That's the basic line of the Shema, the opening line. We say this when we go to bed at night. If a person knows that he's about to die, he would like this to be the last words that he said, declaring God's unity. But then the law that goes along with it is, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your veriness, is one way to translate that. And these words which I command you on this day shall be upon your heart. You shall speak them. You shall teach them diligently to your children, speaking of them when you lie down at night, when you wake up in the morning, when you walk us by the way, and when you're sitting in your house, and when you walk us by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up. And you will bind them as a sign upon your hand, and this shall be a symbol before your eyes, and you will inscribe them on the doorposts of your house and upon your gates, right? So part of that is reciting them when you lie down at night and when you rise up in the morning. So who is an ignoramus? It is anyone who does not recite the Shema in the morning and in the evening with its blessings. Now, with its blessings, you're adding a few psalms and other prayers that are in the prayer book. So according to this view, if you're not a person who does a little bit of praying every night and every morning, you're an ignoramus. This is the statement of Rabbi Meir. And the rabbis, right, the majority say, it is anyone who does not don tefilin, right? So this would be a man. Women are obviously not obligated in tefillin, but a Jewish man, from the time he's bar mitzvah, is obligated to wrap tefillin every day. We don't do it on Shabbos, right? But every other day We don't do it on festivals, but every other day, etc. So anyone who doesn't wrap tefillin. Ben Azai says, it is anyone who does not have tzitzis on his garment, right? I have mine under my shirt. But if you have a garment with corners, you have to have the ritual fringes on them. And that we start even before bar mitzvah for Jewish men. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Yosef said, it is anyone who has sons and does not raise them to study Torah. And Acharim say, or others say, which usually refers to Rabbi Meir, even if one reads the written Torah and learns the Mishnah, but he does not serve Torah scholars, he is an ignoramus. So that is a pretty expansive view of who is an ignoramus. Now you're talking about somebody that even though he has studied the written Torah and he has studied the Mishnah, right? So that's the core of the oral tradition. And how could you call this person an ignoramus? Why? Because he does it on his own, right? And he doesn't submit to learn from the sages and check his knowledge against the sages. And this is a person who might think he knows something, but he doesn't really know anything because he figured it out on his own, and that could lead to grave errors which would cause him to sin. And that's why the sages consider that person an ignoramus. Now, this term, Am-Haaretz, it's not just kind of like a general sort of, maybe mocking or at least very negative term. It has a little bit more legalistic meaning. So says Rav Steinsaltz about the term Am-Haaretz. The term Am-Haaretz, which literally means people of the land, appears actually in the Bible in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. But there it refers only to non-Jews. The term later evolved into a derogatory epithet referring to a Jew who behaves in the manner of a non-Jew. So the concept of an Am-Haaretz was not clearly defined, and therefore there were many opinions among the Tanaim, the rabbis of the Mishnah, with regard to who should be characterized as an Am-Haaretz. And they range from the opinion that the term refers to one who does not serve Torah scholars and learn from them, to the opinion that the term refers to one with no Torah, no Mishnah, and no manners. So according to the first opinion, many learned people were included in this category, right? Because they learned a lot, but didn't sort of submit to the authority and teaching of the sages. So according to the second opinion, right, somebody who's totally ignorant even of any kind of refinement, has no manners in addition to lacking learning. So according to the second opinion, an Am-Haaretz was the basest of individuals, to whom the most derogatory epithets were generally applied. And the common application of the term was to one devoid not only of learning or manners, but also to be devoid of spirituality, with no profession or occupation, no education, and no connection to Torah and mitzvahs. A bum, a drunk, that kind of person. Now, in the Talmudic era, and even more so in later times, the situation changed in two respects. First, while there remained many who were uneducated, the most extreme form of an Am-Haaretz disappeared, as even simple Jews upheld Torah and mitzvahs to the best of their ability. And secondly, to avoid causing rifts within the nation in exile, the laws restricting interactions with an Am-Haaretz were repealed, right? So much so that in modern times you have large groups like Chabad and Aish who not only don't distance themselves from a person who's an Am-Haaretz, but who actually seek them out and say, well, listen, for whatever reason in your life you didn't have the opportunity to learn, but you probably didn't make an active choice not to learn. So here, let us offer you, and Accidental Talmudists is also such an organization where we bring the knowledge out to the people so that they can be exposed to it, and then they can see how rich and beautiful and vibrant and intellectually stimulating this tradition is, and so it becomes available for them, and they can cure Jewish ignorance. Let us continue. If one read the written Torah but did not learn the Mishnah, he is a Boar, B-O-O-R. Now, with regard to one who did not read and did not learn at all, the verse states, "Behold, the days come, says the Lord, and I will sow, S-O-W, the house of Israel and the house of Judah with the seed of man and with the seed of beast," Jeremiah 31:26. Meaning, one who has not studied at all is comparable to a beast. The proper atmosphere of a Jew is one which includes learning, right? So Jews who turn their back on Jewish learning, they're just not leading the life they were destined to lead in this world. Doesn't mean you have to be in yeshiva 8 hours a day, but you have to just set some time aside in your life to do some learning like we're doing here. Now the verse states, "My son, fear the Lord and the king, and meddle not with those who are repeating," Proverbs 24:21. So Rabbi Yitzchak says, these are individuals who repeatedly learn the laws, but do not know the reasons behind them. And the Gemara asks, isn't that obvious? How else could the verse be understood? And the Gemara answers, he states this, lest you say that the verse is referring to individuals who repeatedly commit sins. And this is in accordance with the words of Rav Huna. As Rav Huna says, once a person committed a transgression and repeated it, in his eyes, it became permitted for him. Since the verse could be interpreted in this manner, Rabbi Yitzchak teaches us that the verse is referring to those who learn without understanding. But this idea referred to here, and which we find in several other places in the Talmud, right, is that at first a sin, it seems like you're not supposed to do that. And then you do it. And you engage in it, you don't suffer any immediate negative consequences, and then you start to tell yourself, it must be permitted, right? And the attraction, which begins like a little, silk of a spider web, ends up, you end up attached to the sin like by a thick rope, right? Because you bring that into your life and it becomes a repeated pattern of the transgression. And then you really dig a big hole for yourself in terms of, the accountability that we will all have, if not in this world, then in the next world for all our transgressions. But here in this context, they're stressing the idea that it's not so much, people will sin and attach themselves to sin, but the first way to avoid sin is to know what sin is, right? And people don't even know that they are sinning if they don't learn laws more generally. So, that's why the Jewish learning is so incredibly important, right? You might, sometimes people say, well, I don't really need to engage in Jewish learning. I follow the 10 Commandments. Oh? Do you? Do you follow the 10 Commandments? One of the 10 Commandments is keep Shabbos. And do you know what all the particulars are of keeping Shabbos? Very complicated, very difficult, not easy to keep Shabbos. Takes a lot of learning and asking questions and having a rabbi and making mistakes and finding out you did it wrong and, fixing it and doing it right. And it's a lifetime of learning just to follow the law because the laws are so complicated. It was taught in a Baraisa, the Tanaim, who recite the Tanaitic sources by rote. So here, a Tana, as we've repeated many times, a Tana is one of the sages of the Mishna, right, of the Mishnaic period. Here, we're talking about Tanaim in the Amoraic period, meaning the period of the Gemara, right, after the year 200 of the Common Era. Who are these rabbis that are still being referred to as Tanaim, as opposed to the Amoraim? The Amoraim are the sages of the Gemara period. The Tanaim in the Gemara period are not sort of higher and wiser than the Amoraim, just the opposite. They are people who are able to repeat the words of the Mishnah, right? Remember, this was all an oral tradition that was mostly recited by memory, and there were people who could memorize it without really understanding it. So these are the Tanaim that we're talking about right now. So it's taught in the Baraisa that those Tanaim erode the world, right? Meaning they slowly destroy the world. And the Gemara is puzzled by this statement. Could it enter your mind that they are individuals who erode the world? Ravina says this statement is referring to those who not just memorize the Mishnah, which is a good thing to do and will, be something you do on your way to understanding the Mishnah, but people who've only memorized it without really understanding it and who then issue halachic rulings based on their limited knowledge of the Mishnayos. They might be able to recite them, but they don't understand them. And if you don't understand them at a deep level, how can you issue rulings of law to people who come to you with questions about what is the law? And this is also taught in a baraisa. Rabbi Yehoshua said, are they individuals who erode the world? Aren't they settling the world? As it is stated, his ways, God's ways, halichot, right? His ways, halichot, are eternal, from Habakkuk 3:6. And the sages read the term halichot, ways, as halachot, laws, inferring that one who learns halachos, who learns Jewish laws, attains eternal life. So rather, this is referring to those who issue halachic rulings based on their knowledge of Mishnayos. And something you'll see that's related to this, right, is, like sort of here, in my neighborhood, in my community, my chevra, my friends that I pray with and hang out with from our shul. Here, it's a very Orthodox community, a lot of Hasidic Jews, modern Orthodox. It's kind of diverse for within the Orthodox world, but, we're from Yidden, right? Pious Jews. And a lot of people in this little world here are like very knowledgeable. These are guys who went to yeshiva all their lives and then spent a bunch of years learning in Israel before they came back and started families. And I know that they know a lot more than I do. But when I ask them, a particular question like, can you use this device on a festival, or when can you get a haircut now during this period of counting the Omer, kind of questions like that, where they know very well what the answer is, but they're not rabbis, and I'll say, can you do such and such, and they will always preface by saying, I'm not a rabbi and I'm not your rabbi. This is a question properly for your rabbi. But if you want a quick answer, this is how I learned it and what I do. So what they're doing is they're being very careful not to issue a halachic ruling, even though they have extensive knowledge, because of what you see right here, right? Somebody who issues halachic rulings is a posek, is a rabbi who's trained in issuing rulings. It's a rabbi with a tremendous amount of understanding and experience and education who's in a position to issue halachic rulings. And the rest of us, even though we might know the answer, can never be 100% certain that we know the answer, and certainly not enough to tell somebody else how they should do it. So we'll say, well, this is what I do. This is how I learned it, and I got it from Rabbi so-and-so, or, I looked it up. But, you should be careful, right? Don't rely on me. Now, the Mishna states, our Mishnah here, Mishnah number 2 in chapter 3, that an abstinent woman, right, a woman who does not engage in procreation, let's say, is among those who erode the world. What? Don't we want, women to be modest and not engage in lascivious behavior? And the sages taught a maiden, right, so that's an unmarried woman, who prays constantly, and a neighborly widow who constantly visits her neighbors, and a child whose months of gestation were not completed, these are the people who erode the world. Now, this is going to require some explanation. So the Gemara asks, is that so? But didn't Rabbi Yochanan say we learned the meaning of fear of sin from a maiden, right? From an unmarried woman, we learn what fear of sin is. And the significance of receiving divine reward, we learn that from a widow, right? So this is one of the greatest sages in history saying that I didn't understand what fear of sin really means until I learned it from a young unmarried woman. And I didn't understand what receiving a reward from heaven, what that really meant, until I learned it from a widow. So what is Rabbi Yochanan saying? So the meaning of fear of sin can be learned from a maiden. As Rabbi Yochanan heard, a certain maiden who fell on her face in prayer, and she was saying, Master of the universe, You created the Garden of Eden, and you created Gehenna, right? So meaning heaven and hell. And you created the righteous, and you created the wicked. May it be your will that men shall not stumble because of me, and consequently go to Gehenna. Right? So that's real fear of sin. She's not only praying that she should not give in to any of her own evil urges, but that she should not be, the object of somebody else's evil urge, right? That nobody should look at her and come to lust, etc., and commit transgressions of that sort. So that's a very high fear of sin. And the significance of receiving divine reward, this can be learned from a widow. As there was a certain widow in whose neighborhood there was a synagogue that she could have gone to with a short walk. And despite this, every day she went and prayed in the study hall of Rabbi Yochanan, which was much further away. And Rabbi Yochanan said to her, "My daughter, is there not a synagogue in your neighborhood?" And she said to him, "My teacher, don't I attain a reward for all the steps I take while walking to pray in the distant study hall?" Right? And she felt like by being, of course, in Rabbi Yochanan's study hall, that she's going there to pray. Right? That's fulfilling her obligation to pray. But while she's there, she's going to hear Rabbi Yochanan teaching Torah and be in a very, very pious place that maybe her local synagogue wasn't like that. And so not only is she attaining a reward for praying in that, higher, more righteous place, but for all the hard walking that she did to get there. So the Gemara answers, when it is stated in the basest that a maiden who prays constantly is one who erodes the world, what does that mean? Right? What's wrong with that? Don't you want young people to pray a lot? Isn't that good? So the Gemara asks, is this referring, for example, to Yochani bas Retivi, this woman who constantly prayed and pretended to be saintly, but actually engaged in sorcery, right? So what they're really getting at is hypocrisy. People who seem to be pious, who seem to be righteous, who seem to be living a life in fear of sin and fear of heaven, but actually are doing all kinds of wicked acts in a hidden manner. So the Gemara asks, what is the meaning of a child whose months of gestation were not completed, right? So a preemie, a baby born early, somehow erodes the world? What did that baby do wrong? No. This is a metaphoric phrase. What does it mean? Here in Babylonia, right, as the sages living and learning in the Babylonian Jewish community as opposed to in the land of Israel 2,000 years ago. So here in Babylonia, they interpreted this as alluding to an imperfect, incomplete Torah scholar who scorns his teachers, right? So a Torah scholar who learned enough Torah to develop some understanding of it and then to feel like he's superior to his teachers. That is a dangerous, immature scholar. And Rabbi Abba says, this is a student who has not yet attained the ability to issue halakhic rulings, and yet he issues rulings, and is therefore compared to a prematurely born child. And this is as Rabbi Bahu says that Rav Huna says that Rav says. What is the meaning of that which is written? Quote, for she has cast down many wounded, and a mighty host are all her slain. Proverbs 7:26. So we go phrase by phrase. For she has cast down, Hippola, many wounded. This is referring to a Torah scholar who has not yet attained the ability to issue rulings, and yet he issues rulings. And a mighty host are all her slain. This is referring to a Torah scholar who has attained the ability to issue rulings, but does not issue rulings. Right? So one who has that ability to be a posek and to tell people what the law is in various cases, and who does not use that skill and that talent, that also erodes the world. Because he prevents the masses from learning Torah properly. Now we're on 22b. And until when is it considered too premature for a scholar to issue halakhic rulings? It is until 40 years, right? A Torah scholar should be at least 40 before he starts issuing halakhic rulings. And the Gemara asks, is that so? But didn't Rabbah issue rulings even though he only lived to be 40 years old? And the Gemara answers, it is permitted for a scholar who has not studied for so long to issue rulings when his knowledge reaches the level of the foremost scholar in his city, and they are equal. So if he attains that kind of talent and wisdom at an earlier age, okay, he can do it. But who is at that level? Now, it states in our Mishnah, and those who injure themselves out of false abstinence, the Parishion, these are also people who erode the world. And the sages taught there are 7 pseudo-righteous people who erode the world. Right? So these are people who appear to be righteous and they're not. Who are they? The righteous of Shechem, the self-flagellating righteous, the bloodletting righteous, the pestle-like righteous, the righteous who say, tell me what my obligation is and I will perform it, and those who are righteous due to love, and those who are righteous due to fear. Now, some of these just don't sound so bad. Righteous due to love? Like they love God? That's bad? Righteous due to fear? They fear heaven? That's bad? The righteous who say, well, tell me what my obligation is and I will do it? That sounds pretty good. Why are these considered people who erode the world? Let's see. The Gemara explains. The righteous of Shechem, this is one who performs actions comparable to the action of the people of Shechem who agreed to circumcise themselves for personal gain. This is the Dinah story in Genesis 34, that the prince of Shechem raped Jacob's daughter Dinah, but also fell in love with her and wanted to marry her. Dinah's brothers, right, the 12 sons of Jacob, were extremely angry and offended that this rapist now wants to marry their sister. But they had to proceed carefully because this was a powerful person, right? The prince, of a kind of like a nation, a little city-state, Shechem. And his father, the king, came out and said, listen, my son really wants to marry your daughter. What can we do? And the boys, the brothers said, well, we don't marry people, we don't join a group that is uncircumcised. So if you want to marry our daughters, marry our sister and have us marry your daughters, well, you have to become like us. You have to all become circumcised. So then Shechem, the prince of Shechem, said to his, fellow tribespeople, listen, let's do it. Let's all circumcise ourselves because these, children of Jacob, they're wealthy. They're very wealthy. And if we intermarry with them and they settle down here, it's going to make our little city-state much more powerful than it was before. So they were circumcising themselves not in order to convert to Judaism and live a God-fearing life, a God-loving life, but rather to take on a mitzvah for just, a financial gain, right? So that is somebody who sort of takes on mitzvahs just for financial gain. That is like the righteous of Shechem, and this is somebody who erodes the world. Who is the self-flagellating righteous? This is one who injures his feet as he walks slowly, dragging his feet on the ground in an attempt to appear humble, and he injures his feet in the process. It's somebody who overdoes the humility of a Torah scholar. He's just like walking around a kind of annoying way. That's not what God asks of us. He wants us to be humble, but not so much that we, in a sense, debase the human form and the beauty of the human. The bloodletting righteous, who is that? Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak says that this is one who lets blood by banging his head against the walls because he walks with his eyes shut, ostensibly out of modesty. He's so anxious to avoid any kind of, immodest sight that he might see, that he walks around with his eyes down. He keeps bumping into things. He's overdoing it. The pestle-like righteous, like a mortar and pestle. So Rabbi Bar Shela says this is one who walks bent over like the pestle of a mortar. Again, overdoing his humility. Now, with regard to the righteous one who says, tell me what my obligation is and I will perform it. So the Gemara asks, isn't this virtuous behavior? As he desires to be aware of his obligations. He wants to know what the mitzvahs are that are incumbent upon him so he can do them. Sounds virtuous. So rather, this is referring to one who says, tell me what further obligations are incumbent upon me, and I will perform them. Indicating that he fulfills all of his mitzvahs perfectly and therefore seeks additional obligations. He's taking on additional stringencies because he's so confident that he's already doing everything perfectly. Right? We don't want people adding stringencies to the laws that they follow. And there's this whole category of practices, customs called humras, right, where people are taking on additional stringencies because they want to come a little bit closer to heaven. Now, that's a virtuous desire, but it's problematic because they probably have more learning to do in perfecting the mitzvahs that are already incumbent upon them. And if, like a Nazir, they are rendering something that was permitted to them into something that is prohibited, the sages were quite uncomfortable with that sort of behavior. So it's something to be careful about. Now, the Baraisa also includes in the list of pseudo-righteous people those who are righteous due to love and those who are righteous due to fear, i.e. one who performs mitzvahs due to love of their reward or due to fear of punishment. Now, Abaye and Rava said to the Tana who transmitted this Baraisa, do not teach in the Baraisa those who are righteous due to love and those who are righteous due to fear. In other words, don't include them among the pseudo-righteous. These are good people. As Rabbi Yehuda says that Rav says, and this is a very famous quote in the Talmud, a person should always engage in Torah study and in the performance of the mitzvahs, even if he does not do so for their own sake, as through performance of them not for their own sake, he will eventually come to perform them for their own sake. Right? You shouldn't, do a mitzvah because you want to get the reward at the end of your life, or because you fear being punished for not performing the mitzvah. That's not the reason you should do it. You should do it just because you love God, and God does so much for us, and this is what he asks of us, so we do it. But if you're going to do it just because you fear punishment or you love reward, or even if you're going to do it because you want other people to look at you and say, oh, that is a guy who does lots of mitzvahs, that's the wrong reason for doing mitzvahs. But if you're doing the mitzvahs, that's good, right? Because even if you're doing it for the wrong reason, eventually you'll come to do it for the right reason. And by the way, with specifically the mitzvahs of giving to charity, there it really doesn't matter if you're doing it just so that other people will look up to you as a real charitable guy, which is definitely the wrong motivation that you should have. But from the point of view of the recipient of the charity, right, the guy who's going to eat and wouldn't have otherwise eaten, who's going to be sheltered or clothed and would have otherwise been sheltered or clothed, he doesn't care that you're doing it so that other people look up to you as a charitable guy. He's receiving that charity and it's great for him. So do mitzvahs, learn Torah, even if you're doing it for the wrong reason, eventually you'll come to do it for the right reason. Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak said, that which is hidden, and that which is revealed is revealed. But in heaven, everything is known. And the great court in heaven will exact payment from those who wear the cloak of the righteous, but are in fact unworthy. And the Gemara relates, King Yanai said to his wife before he died, do not be afraid of the Parishion. Now this is referring to the Pharisees, which was a name applied usually by the Sadducees, who did not believe in the oral Torah, to the sages who were transmitting the oral Torah, and they were known as the Pharisees, right? So this King Yanai, this was not a particularly righteous king at all, and the Pharisees were a problem for him. But he said to his wife before he died, you don't have to worry about the Pharisees, and neither should you fear from those who are not Pharisees, meaning the Sadducees. Because in both of these cases, they're quite sincere about their beliefs. Rather, you should beware of hypocrites who appear like Pharisees, as their actions are like the act of the wicked Zimri, and they request a reward like that of the righteous Pinchas. Now, by the way, I remember my friend Schwartz, my dear friend Schwartz, who we miss so much, Rabbi Shlomo Schwartz, who was very involved in outreach and came from Chabad and then ran an organization called Chai Center that is now run by his son and our dear friend Rabbi Mendel Schwartz. And he would say to me that, and he would tell that, he would meet Jews, that he was trying to bring Torah and mitzvahs to them, people who were very secular and not connected to Torah. And he would say, why don't you come listen to the Megillah on Purim? Why don't you light candles on Hanukkah? Why don't you, light candles on a Friday? And they would say to him, well, I don't want to be a hypocrite. I drive on Shabbos. I eat non-kosher food. So if I do this mitzvah, I'm going to seem like a hypocrite. Yeah, that's not a hypocrite like the hypocrites that they're talking about here. Somebody who wants to be perceived as a righteous person. Even that, it's not bad if they're doing mitzvahs. Eventually they'll come to do it without hypocrisy. What Schwartzy was talking about, the people who say, well, I don't keep lots of mitzvahs, so if I do one, I'm going to seem like a hypocrite. He's like, no. Any mitzvah you do is good. The fact that you don't keep other mitzvahs, that's not what we're talking about right now. Right now, you have like a real sort of deficit in your mitzvah account, and anything you do is going to be fantastic. Right, so the classic example is the young boys, Chabad, yeshivas, who go out in the world and ask, men on the street, are you Jewish? Are you Jewish? Are you Jewish? And they say, yes. Have you put on tefillin? Right, so a Jewish man, and there's tragically so many in the world who have never put on tefillin. And then they do put on tefillin because they ran into a Chabad guy who said, come here, let's wrap tefillin right now. It'll be your bar mitzvah. So when you go from somebody who's never put on tefillin to somebody who's put on tefillin even once, tremendous difference in your sort of mitzvah account. Tremendous. If you're a Jewish woman who's never lit candles on Friday, and then you light them even once, incredible increase in your mitzvah count. No need to fear that because you don't keep all kinds of other mitzvahs that somehow this is hypocritical. It's not. So he says, so King Yanai said to his wife, don't be afraid of the Pharisees or the Sadducees, but rather beware of hypocrites who appear like Pharisees, as their actions are like the act of the wicked Zimri, and yet they request a reward like that of the righteous Pinchas, right? So that's the story, the children of Israel wandering in the wilderness after Egypt on the way to the promised land. And there was this episode with the Midianite women who were seducing Jewish men. It caused a tremendous plague and it really angered God. And then this Zimri, who was actually a tribal leader, I believe from the tribe of Shimon, brings one of these Midianite women, a Midianite princess named Cosby, into the encampment and fornicates with her in full view of everyone. And everyone is like so stunned, they don't know what to do. And Aaron's grandson, Pinchas, gets up, picks up a spear, and kills both of them, acting like a zealot, right? And it's questionable whether he did the right thing until God says, I give my covenant of peace to Pinchas and make him one of the Kohanim right now, as of this moment. And actually, we're done. That's as far as we go for today. Sorry I didn't give you the warning to get your comments and questions in. We'll pick it up tomorrow at the regular time, Monday, 6 p.m. Pacific, with Mishna number 3 here in chapter 3. So let's get some comments and questions, if we've got them, on Sotah 22. Bill. Refresh my memory, because I seem to recall the sages were, or at least some were, uncomfortable with the idea of merit postponing the death of the Sotah because it could appear to cast doubt on the honor of innocent women who had drunk the waters. Oh, she isn't really innocent, she just hasn't died yet, and so on, or am I misremembering? Yes, that's the idea, and we're actually going to learn more about that in Mishnah number 3 tomorrow. Right? But there was this kind of merit that could shield even the guilty adulteress from immediate death when she's evaluated by the waters, but she will die. It's just a postponement. The point is, though, like you're saying, like there has to be a general knowledge that this is so, I mean, that is the way it happened. So you need the people to know that that's what's going on, lest they think that she's either a guilty woman and the waters didn't work, or that she's not guilty. She's innocent and yet she is guilty. Now, what I don't know yet, and maybe we'll learn it tomorrow, is if she is indeed guilty and the waters don't kill her because her merit preserves her, is that known at the moment that it happens? We're going to delay that question. Sharon, as a Jewish educator, my experience tells me it isn't the student with learning challenges that is difficult to teach. It is the learner who is indifferent or worse about the importance of Jewish learning in their lives. Right? Exactly. Sharon is commenting on the difference between the idiot and the ignoramus. Right? I called myself an idiot, and Rav Steinsaltz said, no, you're not an idiot. You're an ignoramus. Or at least then, when you were introduced to the Talmud, you were in a state of ignoranomy. Whatever. He said you were an ignoramus, much worse than an idiot, right? An idiot, it's not in anyone's power if they don't have the capability. But the one who is indifferent or turns their back on the importance of Jewish learning in their lives, as Sharon says, that's a much bigger problem. Tom, what does erode the world mean? I would say it means that this causes harm in the world, but it's not, it's not like a king committing idolatry and leading the nation to commit idolatry, which is an obvious, enormous, immediate harm. These are people who sort of chip away at the good things and the solidity of the world by this behavior that is kind of marginal, but you should know that they are just slowly destroying the world. It's bad, but it happens, it works out over time. That badness takes place over time. Joseph says, I'm a little confused. Do the sages praise doing mitzvahs for a reward? It's my understanding that the Sadducees did not believe in the reward of resurrection, yet the Pharisees did. Well, the Sadducees just believed in the written Torah, right? The written Torah doesn't talk about the afterlife and the resurrection of the dead, and so perhaps that's why the Sadducees didn't believe in it. But our sages, who are sometimes called the Pharisees by other people, certainly did believe in those things. The sages themselves started to use this word, Parishion, not to refer to themselves generally, but to talk about people within their midst who were overly punctilious and sort of lost the plot about what their role was in Israel as sages. Now, about this question of, do the sages praise doing mitzvahs for the sake of a reward? It's what we said there, right? No, you should do mitzvahs and you should do Torah study lishma, just for the sake of doing God's will. That should be enough, right? Because we love God, we just do what He says to us. We don't need a reward. We don't need to do it for the reward, and we don't need to do it for fear of punishment. We just do it because we love God and He does so much for us. However, right, says, I think it was Rabbi Yochanan in the name of Rav, that one who does so for the reward, it's okay because at least he's doing the mitzvahs, and as he comes to live a life of mitzvahs, he'll come to understand he'll come to really deepen his relationship with God, and eventually he will do the mitzvahs and the Torah study for their own sake and not for the sake of the reward. That's what I've got for us today. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Monday night, 6 p.m. Pacific, for page 23. And with that, we'll complete, God willing, chapter